Okay, so really I'm going to talk not so much about the model, because you guys have all been good sports and hung in there all day with a modeling session at the very end. So I'm not going to talk so much about the model, but talk more about the journey and some of the learnings here. And so I'm really presenting on behalf of Klaus Romero, who's on the panel as well, who is with Critical Path Institute, who co-chaired this with me, and myself from Pfizer. But that's not why I was chosen to be the co-chair. The reason I was chosen to be the co-chair is because I'm Canadian. And as you well know, we've lived 250 years with our French colleagues. We've lived for almost 200 years without any meaningful invasions from the Americans. We convinced the British 150 years ago that they should leave without a battle. And we enjoy curling with our Scottish colleagues. So we're the perfect consortia leaders, if you're looking for it, right? And the Canadian dollar is at US 75, and we're cheap. So there you go. So first, let me just sort of outline the problem as we saw it, what we call the trialist dilemma. And then we'll talk about the trialist dilemma and the advantages of going it alone versus a consortia approach. And then we'll talk about CAMD, and you've heard about the critical path, so I won't spend too long on that. Talk a little bit about some of the issues with standards and collection that we faced. And then the knowledge model. I'm calling it a knowledge model for disease progression. In this case, we underwent a qualification process with EMA and FDA. So it's a little different than the standard sorts of modeling and simulation approaches you might do in your standard drug submissions. And then some of the lessons learned. So this is sort of the world. This is in Brian world. This is what it looks like for the clinical trialist. So really, I think in most cases, the clinical trialist or the decision maker on a project, he's focused on the readout of the data from a study. He's got to make a decision. Do I go into phase 2? Do I go into phase 3? Do we submit? So he's very good probably using the data from the last study and pretty good at using the information that's contained within the project. But as we go out into the sort of the broader sphere of knowledge, as I'll call it, he probably has information from other programs internally. I mean, in reality, our primary product in pharma is dead compounds, right? So we have a wealth of information, which we don't actually use that terribly well to inform us about future trial designs. Then we've got external data. So for example, there may be initiatives, NIH initiatives, natural history studies, et cetera, that inform us. And then we've got open data that's out there. And then we've got literature sources from past information, and then the real world data. And then, you know, this is actually sort of becoming a three-dimensional problem now. We're all generating data as we sit here. You know, you've all got accelerometers in your pockets. I hate to tell you, it's not going to look very good for your function today because you've been sitting here for 8 hours, but you know, you're generating that data, right? So it's sitting there. So that's the easy part of the equation in my mind. The hard part is actually the other part, which is, you know, how do we organize that? And then once we do, how do we deal with the human element? We don't talk very much about that. And the human elements are sort of those biases and heuristics that we sort of deal with as decision makers in your organizations, right? So we've got the confirmation bias. We're looking for the result that we want. We've got the framing and the anchoring. So, you know, me telling you that I'm a modeler sets your expectation very low for the presentation, right? So you'll think, you know, it's a good presentation, okay? The availability heuristic. So, you know, we tend to focus on data that we last saw, right? So I like to call it the last paper carried forward. That last paper basically carries a lot of weight in your mind when you're making decisions and how you think about a problem. All right. So you can imagine that within each organization, right, we all have different data, and some of it's big and some of it's little, right? And as a result, we're all going to have different results and different opinions, I guess is in the parlance of this morning. And so that's one approach, and the logical consequence of this is we all have different results. And the other approach is to sort of take the consortia approach. And that's really what we did here. We formed, this consortium was called the Coalition Against Major Diseases, focused primarily on Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, biomarkers, modeling as being part of that. Okay, so you've seen this partnering with patient groups, patient with FDA, EMA, in a pre-competitive sort of space. All right, so CPATH has a lot of collaborators, patient groups, health authorities, pharma, academics, you name it, many, many different people. And so part of our remit and our direction was given by this broader group. But in reality, in any consortia, it sort of always boils down to a key group of people that drive the work. And so we were very fortunate here that we have, within this group, we had people that were sort of have modeling expertise, consulting expertise. Richard Mose, who was part of the original development of this particular instrument that we were looking at, which was the ADAS-Cog. People from the FDA that were helping, people from the EMA who were advocates, leading clinicians in the field, and the Alzheimer's Association. So a nice consortia to sort of build a model within. All right. So I think it's been mentioned before, in this particular case, a clear context of use. And that was critical here because I think, there's a concern that what we didn't want is, this to be sort of your rescue line for a failed drug program, right? That wasn't the intent. The intent here is really to develop a drug disease trial model that can describe the progression, right? The drug effects from the literature, what we had, dropout rates, and if you look around the room, we've got a pretty good dropout rate here today, so that's important. Got to keep that in mind. Placebo effects, and the relevant sources of variability, because if you're powering a study, getting the variability wrong, as you all know, can be a very costly endeavor. So again, the first take was data in has to be suitable for the questions that you're asking. As you well know, if the data is not clean, right, and you have a perfect model, you're still going to have a bad result. And if you've got perfect data and you've got a bad model, you're going to get a bad result. So as was described this morning, there was a lot of janitorial work that had to be done, but with professional janitors, right? People that are trained in CDISC standards to clean that data up and make sure it works. And those folks who are at the Critical Path Institute did a great job. Experienced modeling team, and we derived process for getting qualification. So in our case, we had data coming in from different sponsors, different sources like the Academies trial, for example. And as part of that, the consortia had to go back and actually form the CDISC standards in the first place. That adds time to the process. Integrating the data, which then allowed the modeling to take place. Okay, so basically in this case, it boiled down, the patient level data boiled down to about 3,200 patients worth of data. And in addition, we had data from a natural history study called Academies, and we actually captured the literature. So we captured 2 or 3 different types of data in this process. When you do that, it requires some statistical heavy work for capturing different types of data. But in reality, what we've developed here is a tool that allows us to sort of do the trial simulations, account for dropout, understand the natural progression of the disease based on various covariates that might change or that you might want to vary in your inclusion criteria. And the plan and the way you use it is basically with your proprietary data, you bring in your assumptions about what you think you've got to aid you in your trial simulations and design of the trial. So you optimize your trial to answer the questions for your stage of development. Okay, and the data is basically stored in the Critical Path Institute database. Okay, in this case, the tool was a longitudinal cognitive instrument called the ADAS-Cog. We also had baseline information, demographics. Covariates included things like the demographics, genetics. The biomarkers piece, where we were when we did this work, the biomarkers, there was a lot of inter-lab variability. So again, when we pooled that data, the baseline values for the disease could be double in one set versus the other. So it didn't really allow us to incorporate the biomarkers. That's something we'll probably go back and do at a later point. Okay, the result, basically publication, so we got appropriate peer review, and a disease progression model that gives you quantitative estimates. Depending, you can vary the covariates. It allows you to plan trials in a quantitative manner. Took a while, took 3 years, 7 months, and 9 days, sort of from our first interaction with the health authorities to the end. But we were successful in both cases, and I think in many ways helped to sort of set the path for how this can be done in the future. So the key learnings. In our case, at least, the data standards were critical, I think. We observed that even amongst pharma, even amongst the same company from different programs, the instrument was scored differently, for example, and that can lead to very different conclusions about what you're looking at. Partner early with health authorities if you want to qualify the tool, and establish that context of use. And then in our case, once you've built it, you have to think about how is the model going to be supported? Are there a community of users, for example, that you're going to train? When new data comes, how are you going to update? I think it's been successful. We've got the critical path has a number of ongoing consortia talking about this. There's another pre-conference in a few days that the American Association of Pharmaceutical Sciences is going to talk about this approach and how they can do it in a more meaningful way. So it's catching on. In my role, I'm also a president of an international society of modelers. So in that role, they would take away my honorary modeling badge if I didn't leave you with at least one equation. So here it is. So in the cases of consortia, success is really a function of time. So you and your organizations have to be willing to put in some time, right? And perseverance and sticking with it. So I think in these cases, it's going to take a long time. There's got to be a commitment if you really want to take this approach. So thank you.